Colton Rains awoke with an uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Something was off. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes as he listened carefully to the world outside his window. Usually, the early hours of the day brought a familiar chorus, the distant rumble of garbage trucks, the chirping of birds flitting between tree branches, and the occasional bark of a restless neighborhood dog. But today, silence hung thick in the air, as if the entire street had taken a collective breath and forgotten to exhale. He glanced at the clock, 7:12 a.m. Strange. He threw on a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt before stepping toward the window. Pulling back the curtain, his eyes locked onto an unfamiliar sight, a bright yellow tow truck idling in his driveway, its engine humming softly. Two men in pale blue polo shirts stood near it, one tapping at a clipboard while the other examined the rear of Colton's car, a sleek black Charger. His gut twisted in immediate suspicion. Something wasn't right. Colton's gaze sharpened as he took in the two men, their matching attire screaming the kind of self-importance found in overzealous HOA volunteers. He recognized them vaguely, Tim and Roy, two men who had recently taken it upon themselves to enforce the most minor infractions in the neighborhood with an almost religious fervor. But what were they doing in his driveway? He moved swiftly, throwing on his shoes and grabbing his phone before heading out the front door. The moment he stepped onto his porch, the two men stiffened. Tim, the shorter of the two with thinning hair and a permanent scowl, looked up from his clipboard and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Morning, sir," he called, his voice artificially polite. "Just a routine check. Seems your vehicle has been in the same spot for over 48 hours. HOA policy states that any car left unmoved for that period is subject to removal." Colton frowned, crossing his arms. "And who authorized this?" he asked, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to giving orders. Tim and Roy exchanged glances before Roy, the taller man with a gut that strained against his polo, responded with an affected air of confidence. "It's standard procedure, Chief." Colton narrowed his eyes, his patience already wearing thin. "First of all," he said, stepping off the porch, "my car is parked in my own driveway, not on the street. Second, I haven't violated any laws or HOA regulations. And third," he gestured toward the tow truck, where the driver was already moving toward the hydraulic lift, "you better not even think about hooking my car up to that thing." Tim lifted his clipboard like it was some sort of holy decree. "Actually, sir, page 17, Section 4 of the HOA bylaws states that vehicles left stationary for more than 48 hours, Colton cut him off with a sharp laugh. "I know exactly what the bylaws say, Tim. And I also know they don't apply here." He watched as the tow truck driver hesitated, his hands hovering over the equipment. Roy, however, was undeterred. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to something more condescending. "We're just following orders. If you have an issue, take it up with the HOA board." He patted his pocket, where a cheap plastic badge glinted in the morning light. "We're authorized enforcers, sir." Colton took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Authorized enforcers," he echoed, his voice laced with amusement. "Tell me, gentlemen, do you have any actual legal authority?" Tim puffed out his chest. "We have full backing from the HOA to carry out compliance checks and enforce penalties." He pointed at the badge clipped to his belt, a flimsy, mass-produced piece of plastic that looked like it had come from a novelty store. "This says otherwise," Colton replied, stepping closer. "You're not law enforcement. You don't have the right to tow vehicles from private property without consent or a legitimate legal reason." Roy scoffed. "We don't need your consent. You agreed to HOA rules when you moved in." He turned and waved at the tow truck driver. "Let's move it." The driver hesitated, glancing between Roy and Colton. That was when Colton decided he'd had enough. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and held it up for them to see. "You're right about one thing," he said coolly. "I did agree to HOA rules when I moved in. But here's what you seem to have forgotten," he paused, watching their expressions shift from smug confidence to creeping uncertainty. "I'm Colton Rains, the chief of police for this city. And you two are about 5 seconds away from committing a crime." Silence blanketed the scene, the weight of Colton's words crashing down on Tim and Roy like a tidal wave. Roy blinked, his face turning an alarming shade of red, while Tim took an instinctive step back. The tow truck driver, who had been cautiously reaching for the lift controls, froze in place, his eyes widening in realization. Roy started, licking his lips nervously. We were just doing our job, Chief." Colton took another step forward, his posture relaxed but commanding. "Your job," he repeated, letting the words hang. "Your job is to uphold community guidelines, not to pretend you're law enforcement and attempt to steal people's vehicles under false pretenses." He gestured toward his car. "This isn't just unethical, it's illegal. You know what attempted theft of a motor vehicle gets you in this state." Tim swallowed hard, shaking his head. 5 years, Colton answered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That's what you're looking at if you try to hook up that car right now." Roy let out a nervous chuckle, though the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his fear. "Come on, Chief, no need to escalate things." Colton arched an eyebrow. "I'm not escalating anything, Roy. You too did that when you brought a tow truck to my driveway without a legal right to do so." Tim turned toward the truck driver, his voice thin. Maybe we should hold off." But before the situation could dissolve any further, another voice cut through the morning air, a voice Colton knew well. "Everything okay here, Chief?" Sergeant Diaz stood at the end of the driveway, his patrol car idling behind him, Officer Monroe at his side. Backup had arrived. Tim and Roy stiffened at the sight of the uniformed officers, their bravado crumbling like a house of cards. Sergeant Diaz, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, strolled toward the scene, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Officer Monroe followed, her presence adding to the weight of authority now pressing down on the self-proclaimed HOA enforcers. Diaz folded his arms, looking between Colton and the two men. "Got a call about a potential vehicle theft," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Tim fumbled with his clipboard, gripping it like a lifeline. No theft," he stammered. "Just an HOA compliance check. The chief's vehicle has been parked in the same spot for over 48 hours, which is a violation of HOA policy." Monroe scoffed. "A parked car in a private driveway is not a violation of anything," she said, stepping forward. "Unless there's an actual city ordinance backing this up, which I know there isn't, you two are attempting an illegal tow." Tim's face twisted in frustration. "Look, we're just enforcing the rules," he insisted, his voice a little too high-pitched. "He agreed to them when he moved in." Colton let out a sharp exhale, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Tim," he said evenly, "you do realize that a private HOA rule doesn't override state law, right? And that trying to remove my car without my consent is not just a violation, it's criminal." He glanced at Diaz, who nodded in agreement. "It's called unauthorized use of a tow service," Diaz added. "And if you proceed, it's attempted grand theft. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of the neighborhood. Residents peeked through windows and stood on porches, murmuring amongst themselves. Some held up their phones, recording the escalating confrontation. A few neighbors had even ventured onto the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold with barely contained amusement. Colton spotted Mr. Hendricks, the retired Marine from 2 houses down, shaking his head with a smirk. Mrs. Patel from across the street had her arms crossed, whispering something to her teenage son, who was filming the entire event with barely disguised glee. It didn't take long for word to spread. By now, at least a dozen people had gathered, their cameras trained on Tim and Roy. The realization seemed to dawn on the two men simultaneously. Tim glanced nervously at the growing crowd, his grip tightening on his clipboard. Roy's earlier arrogance had all but vanished, replaced by a sickly shade of pale. "You guys should really reconsider your approach," Monroe said dryly, nodding toward the spectators. "This isn't exactly the kind of PR your HOA wants." Colton, meanwhile, let the moment hang. Let them feel the weight of their mistake. Let them squirm under the scrutiny of their own neighbors. Finally, Roy broke. "Maybe we should, double-check with the HOA board," he muttered to Tim, who nodded a little too eagerly. But before they could fully retreat, a new voice sliced through the air. Sharp, clipped, and full of self-righteous authority, Marlene Sinclair, the HOA president, stormed onto the scene with all the grace of a military commander preparing for battle. A petite woman in her late 50s, She was dressed in her usual iron-pressed slacks and a floral blouse that did little to soften the perpetual scowl on her face. Her short, platinum hair was styled in a way that suggested she had spent the morning screaming at someone over the phone. "What in the world is going on here?" she demanded, heels clicking against the pavement as she made a beeline for Tim and Roy. "Why is there a police presence? Why is this taking so long?" Tim and Roy, desperate for an out, immediately pointed at Colton. "He's refusing to comply, Marlene," Roy blurted. "His car's been parked for more than 48 hours. That's a violation of—" "I don't need a recap, Roy," Marlene snapped, her eyes flicking toward Colton. Her expression shifted slightly, recognition flashing across her face, but she wasn't deterred. "Chief Rains," she said, plastering on a tight smile. "I'm sure you understand that community rules exist for a reason. The integrity of our neighborhood depends on compliance. Now, I'm certain this is all just a misunderstanding, but if you've left your car unattended for over 48 hours, we do have the right to issue a fine and remove it if necessary." Colton tilted his head, studying her with amusement. "I see," he said slowly. "And who, exactly, gave you the legal authority to enforce this rule on private property?" Marlene bristled. "The HOA board has full jurisdiction over neighborhood regulations." Monroe let out a short laugh. "No, you don't," she said bluntly. "Not without the property owner's consent or a court order." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Marlene's face. She turned to Tim and Roy, her lips pursing. "You did check with the legal committee before proceeding, correct?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Tim swallowed hard. We thought it was a straightforward policy enforcement." "So you didn't," Diaz concluded, arms still crossed. "Marlene, you might want to think very carefully about your next move. Because right now, your HOA is about to commit a felony on camera." Marlene's face paled. She glanced at the growing number of phones pointed in her direction, then at the officers standing before her, then finally at Colton, who, for all his calm demeanor, radiated the quiet authority of a man who had just let someone dig their own grave. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a crushing force. She turned sharply to Tim and Roy. "Unhook the car. Now." "But Marlene," Roy stuttered. "I said now," she snapped, voice like a whip. The two men scrambled toward the tow truck, hurriedly undoing the straps as the gathered neighbors whispered and chuckled amongst themselves. "And the fine?" Colton asked coolly. Marlene forced a stiff smile. "I think we can waive it, this time." "Not good enough," Colton said, folding his arms. "I want a public email to the entire HOA membership clarifying that this was an error. And I want it today." Marlene opened her mouth, likely to argue, but one look at Diaz, who was now holding his radio, ready to escalate this to an official investigation, shut her down. The moment the straps were removed, the tension in the air gave way to open mockery. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, a few neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief. "Well, this is embarrassing," Mr. Hendricks called out with a chuckle. "Marlene, you might want to read up on the law before trying to scam people." "Oh, don't worry," Mrs. Patel added. "This is definitely going in the neighborhood group chat." Her son smirked, holding up his phone. "Already posted." Marlene's jaw tightened, her face burning with humiliation. She turned on her heel and stalked away without another word, leaving Tim and Roy to awkwardly shuffle after her. The tow truck driver, sensing his services were no longer needed, climbed into his cab and pulled away, eager to distance himself from the debacle. Colton exhaled, shaking his head as he watched them retreat. Diaz clapped him on the shoulder. "That was entertaining," he said with a smirk. "You should charge for these kinds of shows." Colton chuckled. "If I did, I'd be a millionaire by now." Monroe let out a laugh, nodding toward the cameras still rolling. "Speaking of money, you're about to be famous, Chief. This is definitely going viral." Colton sighed. "Great," he muttered. "Just what I needed, an HOA scandal with my name on it." Marlene stormed off, her back stiff with suppressed rage, but there was no salvaging the situation. The damage was done. Tim and Roy followed her like scolded schoolboys, their heads lowered, their once smug expressions replaced with embarrassment. The neighbors were still recording, and the laughter continued to ripple through the crowd as the spectacle came to its inevitable conclusion. The tow truck rumbled away, its driver more than happy to escape the mess, leaving only the fading scent of diesel in its wake. Colton watched them retreat with a measured expression, but inside, he felt a sharp sense of satisfaction. The HOA had overplayed its hand, thinking it could bully just another resident. But they had failed to realize they had picked the wrong man to intimidate. He turned back toward his car, running a hand along the roof absent-mindedly. "Well, that was an interesting start to the day," he muttered. Diaz smirked, adjusting his duty belt. "I'd say, only in this neighborhood, but let's be honest, HOAs pull this nonsense everywhere." Monroe chuckled, shaking her head. At least now they know who they're dealing. Colton wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and typed up a quick email to the HOA board, CCNG Marlene, and a few of the more reasonable members he had interacted with in the past. Subject: formal demand for public acknowledgement and policy clarification. He kept the message professional, but firm, highlighting the illegal nature of the attempted tow, the misuse of HOA power, and the public spectacle it had become. He reiterated his demand for an official email to all residents, acknowledging that the HOA had overstepped its bounds and clarifying that private driveways were not under HOA jurisdiction for vehicle removal. He sent it off with a satisfying tap of his thumb. Marlene would hate it, but at this point, she had no choice. The incident was already public, and attempting to sweep it under the rug would only make things worse for her. She would comply. She had to. He turned to Diaz. "You sticking around for the fallout, or is your work here done?" Diaz grinned. "Oh, I'm definitely watching this unfold. It's not every day we get front-row seats to the HOA self-destructing in real time." Didn't take long. Within a few hours, the footage had spread beyond the neighborhood's group chat and onto local social media pages. People loved a good HOA takedown, and this had all the ingredients of a viral hit: an overreaching homeowners association, a ridiculous attempt at enforcing a non-existent rule, and the perfect twist: their victim turning out to be the chief of police. The video clips were stitched together into a highlight reel, complete with dramatic music and captions like "HOA tries to tow the wrong car" and "How to lose your authority in 60 seconds." Comments poured in, most of them mocking Marlene's arrogance and the HOA's blatant disregard for the law. "How do these HOAs get away with this crap?" one user wrote. "They thought they were the law, and then boom, plot twist," another added. Someone even made a meme of Tim and Roy standing in front of the tow truck, with the caption, "When you pretend to be cops and the actual police show up." By the afternoon, local news stations had picked up the story, and Colton received a call from a reporter asking for a statement. He declined, letting the video speak, for by evening, the pressure had reached its peak. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, one that was supposed to be private but had already been infiltrated by residents eager for answers. Marlene looked like she had aged 10 years since that morning, her usually sharp demeanor dulled by the weight of the scandal. She tried to regain control, arguing that the incident had been a simple misunderstanding, but the residents weren't buying it. One by one, they voiced their frustration, not just about this incident, but about years of overreach, fines for minor infractions, and ridiculous attempts at micromanaging the community. "You've embarrassed this entire neighborhood," one resident snapped. "This isn't a dictatorship, Marlene," another added. "You don't get to make up the rules as you go." Under mounting pressure, Marlene was forced to do exactly what Colton had demanded: send out a public email admitting the HOA's error. The message, which arrived in every resident's inbox that night, was painfully formal but clear. "The HOA acknowledges that the recent attempt to remove a vehicle from private property was a misinterpretation of our authority. We apologize for any confusion this may have caused and will be reviewing our enforcement policies to prevent future incidents." It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology, but it was enough. Colton read the email, his lips twitching with amusement. "Misinterpretation of authority," he repeated, shaking his head. It was the closest Marlene would ever get to admitting she had completely overstepped. He shut his phone off and leaned back on his couch, letting the events of the day settle in. His car was safe, the HOA had been humiliated, and the residents had finally found their voice against the board's overreach. It wasn't just about this one incident, it was about setting a precedent. If the HOA thought they could throw their weight around unchecked, they had been sorely mistaken. Monroe had been right. Now, they knew exactly who they were dealing with. As he took a sip of his evening coffee, Colton smiled to himself. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would wake up to a very different reality. one where the HOA no longer had the power to bully its residents without consequence. And that was a victory worth savoring.